There is a specific quality to the light in Istanbul just before dusk. It is not the harsh gold of noon, nor the soft purple of evening, but something in between, a kind of amber memory. It falls upon the domes of ancient mosques, catches the dust motes drifting through the air of the Grand Bazaar, and if you are standing in the right place, it slants through the high windows of the Topkapi Palace Library. Imagine that light. Imagine it falling in the year 1929 upon the gloved hands of a German theologian named Gustav Diesmann. He is not looking for maps. He is cataloguing books, sorting through the detritus of an empire. But fate, as it so often does in these old, stone-cold places, has other plans. His fingers brush against a roll of painted gazelle skin, forgotten on a dusty shelf. He unrolls it, and in that single, amber-lit moment, the world cracks open just a little. For what he holds is not merely a map. It is a confession, inked in pigment and line. It is a message from a ghost, a piece of parchment that seemed to know things it should not have known. It showed the coastlines of the old world with surprising accuracy, the bulge of Africa, the sweep of Europe. But it was what lay on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean that stopped the heart. There, drawn in careful, confident strokes, was a landmass that resembled the eastern coast of a continent no European was supposed to have seen. Not in 1513, not when this map was made. The question that rose from that parchment, carried on the dust of the Topkapi Library, was not where is this place? The question was, how could they have known? This is the story of a piece of skin that held a secret that would challenge our understanding of history, of exploration, and of the very nature of knowledge itself. It is a story of ambition, of genius, and of the one thing that terrifies empires more than any army, the truth. For what we believe about our past shapes who we are. And if that belief is based on a lie or on a truth we are not ready to accept, then the very ground beneath our feet begins to tremble. So draw close to the fire, let the candle burn low, and let us trace the ghost lines on the parchment as we journey into the mystery of the map that changed the world. Keep the candle lit, for the shadows hold secrets. There is a particular kind of man born only on the edges of empires. Men who speak the languages of both the conqueror and the conquered. Men who can read the stars as easily as they read the currents. Men for whom the horizon is not a boundary, but a summons. His name was Haji Ahmed Muhyiddin Piri, but the world would come to know him by a simpler name, the name that would carry his legacy across the centuries, Piri Reis, Admiral. To understand the map, you must first understand the hands that drew it. And those hands were not the soft, ink-stained fingers of a cloistered scholar. They were hands calloused by rope burn, hands that had gripped the hilt of a scimitar in the smoke of a naval battle, hands that had pulled men from a churning sea and perhaps pushed others beneath the waves. He was born around 1470 in Gelibolu, a Gallipoli that was then a window onto two worlds. From his childhood window, he could watch the ships of the Ottomans massing for war and the merchant vessels of the Venetians slipping through the straits with their cargoes of silk and suspicion. The water was his first teacher. And his second teacher was his uncle, Kemal Reis, a name whispered with fear from the coasts of Spain to the islands of Greece. Kemal was a corsair, a privateer in the service of the Ottoman sultan. He was a wolf of the sea, and young Piri was his cub. In 1486, when Piri was barely a man, he joined his uncle's fleet. For the next 2 decades, he lived a life that would shatter a modern imagination. They were not merely sailors, they were hunters. Their prey were the ships of Christian powers, Venetian galleons, Genoese carracks, Spanish treasure ships. They would stalk them for days, reading the wind and the water, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. In these years, Piri Reis learned the geography of the Mediterranean not from a book, but from the keel of his ship. He knew the hidden reefs of the Adriatic, the treacherous currents off Corsica, the secret anchorages of the North African coast. Every cape, every bay, every shallow was etched into his memory with the sharp tool of survival. But the true education began in the looting. When a ship was taken, the cargo was the prize. Silk, gold, spices, timber, and often, in the personal chests of captured captains, something far more valuable than any of these: charts, maps, portolans. These were not the decorative maps of the ancient geographers filled with monsters and myths. These were working documents. They were the accumulated knowledge of generations of sailors, passed from hand to hand, corrected and updated with every voyage. They were the enemy's strategy laid bare on parchment. Piri Reis knew their worth. A captured map could reveal a trade route, a hidden port, a vulnerable coastline. It was intelligence, it was power, and he taught his nephew to hoard them like jewels. And then, one day, the sea gave up its greatest secret. It was the year 1501. Piri Reis's fleet was patrolling the waters off the coast of Spain. Among the prizes they took was a Spanish vessel, and among the prisoners was a man who claimed to be a sailor. He was frightened, desperate, and offered the only thing of value he possessed in exchange for his life. It was not gold. It was a small, worn chest. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth to protect it from the salt, was a book of maps unlike any Piri or his uncle had ever seen. The sailor, trembling, told them it had belonged to his captain, a man who had sailed to the west, a man who had sailed for the Spanish crown, a man named Colombo, Christopher Columbus. The sailor spoke of islands beyond the ocean of darkness, of green shores and naked peoples, of a world that turned the old maps into lies. Piri Reis held that book in his hands. He studied its lines, its strange new coastlines, its hopeful depictions of paradise. He did not know it then, but in that moment, on the deck of a captured ship, with the blood of battle still wet on the planks, the seed of his great work was planted. The map that would change everything was already beginning to form in his mind. For he was a man with two names, Piri the admiral, a man of action and steel, and Piri the scholar, a man of ink and curiosity. And in the years to come, these two men would finally sit down together to stitch the world back into one piece. Keep the candle lit. A map is never just a map. It is a palimpsest, a parchment that has been scraped clean and written upon again, yet still bears the faint traces of the words that came before. Every line drawn by a cartographer is a ghost of another line, drawn by another hand in another time. Piri Reis, sitting in the quiet of his study in Gelibolu in the year 1513, was not creating something new. He was conjuring something old. He was a medium, channeling the voices of dead geographers. We know this because he told us so. In the margins of his great map, in the elegant, flowing script of Ottoman Turkish, he wrote a confession. He did not claim to have sailed to the western lands. He did not claim to have discovered anything. He wrote simply that he had compiled his map from approximately 20 source charts. Some were contemporary, drawn by Portuguese and Arab sailors who were then probing the coasts of Africa and India. Some were ancient, dating back to the time of Alexander the Great. And some, he wrote, were maps drawn by Columbus himself. This is the heart of the mystery. It is not the lines on Piri Reis's map that are so astonishing. It is the ghost lines beneath them. The question that haunts this story is not how Piri Reis knew so much. The question is, who knew it before him? Imagine a library, not a quiet modern building with reading lamps and card catalogues. Imagine the Library of Alexandria. Imagine its marble halls, its scroll-filled niches, its air heavy with the perfume of cedar oil used to preserve the papyrus. Imagine the minds that walked there. Aristarchus, who argued that the earth moved around the sun. Eratosthenes, who calculated the circumference of the earth with stunning accuracy, using only a well, a stick, and the angle of a shadow. And imagine the maps they must have drawn, maps based on the reports of Phoenician sailors who had circumnavigated Africa, maps based on the voyages of Pythias who sailed to the frozen north and described a place where the sea became solid. Now imagine the fire. In 48 BCE, Julius Caesar, besieged in Alexandria, ordered the torching of the Egyptian fleet in the harbor. The fire spread. It leaped from the ships to the docks, from the docks to the warehouses, and finally to the library itself. The flames consumed not just scrolls, but centuries of accumulated human knowledge. They devoured star charts, historical records, medical texts, and most certainly, maps. What was lost in that fire, we will never know, but the ghost lines survived. They survived in fragments, in copies, in the memories of scholars who fled the flames. They survived in the libraries of Constantinople, of Rome, of the great Islamic academies in Baghdad and Cordoba. For the knowledge did not die. It went underground. It was preserved by those who understood its value, passed from hand to hand in secret, like a forbidden scripture. Consider the portolan charts of the Middle Ages. These nautical maps, which first appeared in the 13th century, are a profound mystery in themselves. They depict the Mediterranean and Black Sea coastlines with a level of accuracy that seems to defy the technology of the time. They are crisscrossed with rum lines, the spiderweb of navigational bearings that allowed a sailor to plot a course from one port to another. How were they made? There are no records of the surveying methods used to create them. They seem to appear from nowhere, fully formed. Some historians have suggested they are the descendants of lost Roman military charts, perhaps based on surveys conducted for the empire. Others whisper of an even older origin. These are the ghostlines, the knowledge that was never truly lost, only sleeping. It was this sleeping knowledge that Piri Reis awakened. He took the charts of Columbus, which were themselves based on the lore of his voyages. He took the charts of the Portuguese, who were just then feeling their way down the coast of Africa. He took the ancient charts, the ones from the time of Alexander, the ones that had somehow survived the flames of Alexandria, and he stitched them together. He did not understand all that he was stitching. He could not have known that some of his source maps contained memories of a time before the ice. He was simply a craftsman doing his work, trusting the ghosts who guided his hand. The result was not a map of the world as it was known in 1513. It was a map of the world as it had been known for millennia, a map that held secrets its own maker could not fully comprehend. We will need to look closer. Keep the candle lit. Let us slow down, let us look. We are not in a library now, nor on a ship. We are in a place outside of time. We are looking at the thing itself, the map of Piri Reis, the original gazelle skin, preserved now in the Topkapi Palace Library in Istanbul, but in our minds it lies before us, unfurled on a table of dark wood. The first thing that strikes you is the color. It is not the stark black and white of a printed page. It is a landscape of faded pigments. The parchment itself is a warm, honeyed brown, the color of old varnish of age. Upon it, the coastlines are drawn in a fine, confident line of black ink. The seas are not left empty. They are filled with decorative elements, stylized waves, mythical creatures, and the ships of various nations, tiny and precise, sailing forever on their ink-drawn oceans. The mountains are represented by a series of shaded peaks, like the spines of sleeping dragons. The rivers are delicate blue ribbons. The cities are marked by tiny fortresses and towers, each one a promise of civilization in the vastness of the world. And then there is the writing. It is everywhere. The map is not a silent image, it is a talkative one. In the margins, in the empty spaces of the sea, in the interiors of unexplored continents, there are blocks of text, notes, explanations, confessions. They are written in the elegant script of Ottoman Turkish, a language that is itself a work of art. Each letter is a curve and a flourish, a testament to the care with which this object was made. Look here, in one of these cartouches, the mapmaker has signed his work. He has given us a date. He writes that he completed this map in the month of Muharram in the year 919 of the Islamic calendar. Our calendar places it in the spring of the year 1513. Let that date sink into you. In 1492, Columbus had made his first voyage. By 1513, the existence of the Caribbean islands was known in Europe, but the vastness of the American continents was still a rumor, a hypothesis. Magellan had not yet circumnavigated the globe. The Pacific Ocean had not yet been seen by a European eye. The interior of Africa was a blank space filled with imagined kingdoms and monstrous races. And yet here, on this piece of gazelle skin, drawn in Istanbul by an Ottoman admiral who had never crossed the Atlantic, we see a depiction of the world that seems to know too much. Move your gaze north. There is the coast of Spain and Portugal, recognizable and familiar. There is the bulge of West Africa, charted with surprising accuracy. Sail down the coast, past the green islands that Piri Reis, following his Portuguese sources, has marked as the Cape Verde Islands. And then cross the ocean. To the west, on the left side of the map, there is a large landmass. It is not the amorphous blob of islands that Columbus described. It is a continent. It has a long, sweeping coastline that runs from north to south. There are mountains, marked in the same careful style as the mountains of Spain. There are rivers flowing into a great ocean. There are strange animals drawn from the mapmaker's imagination, but the coastline itself, that is no imagination. Piri Reis has drawn the eastern coast of the Americas. He has drawn it nearly 3 decades before the first European map would attempt a similar feat. He has drawn it with a confidence that suggests he is not guessing, he is copying. And he has labeled it. He writes in the margin that these lands were discovered by a Genoese infidel named Colombo, and that they are filled with strange creatures, parrots, and gold. He is giving credit where he believes credit is due. He thinks he is simply reproducing the discoveries of Columbus. But Columbus never saw a continent. Columbus died believing he had reached the outskirts of Asia. The coast that Piri Reis has drawn is not the coast of the Caribbean islands. It is the coast of a mainland. It is, some scholars believe, the coast of South America, perhaps even Brazil. How could a map drawn in 1513, based on charts from Columbus's own voyages, show a coastline that Columbus himself never mapped? The parchment lies there, silent and still, but the questions it raises are not silent. They are a chorus of whispers growing louder with every passing moment. We are only beginning to see what is written here. Keep the candle lit. Look down now, to the south, to the very edge of the known world. In 1513, the southern hemisphere was a vast, terrifying blank. The ancient geographers had spoken of a great southern continent, a terra australis, that must exist to balance the weight of the northern lands. But it was a philosophical necessity, not a geographical fact. No one had seen it. No one had mapped it. It was a myth, a place on maps where cartographers would write, "Here be dragons." Now look at the bottom of Piri Reis's map. There is no empty space. There is no "Here be dragons." There is a coastline. It stretches across the bottom of the parchment, a long, irregular line of mountains and bays. It is drawn with the same confident hand, the same careful detail as the coasts of Spain and Africa. It is not a mythical continent, a vague blob of land. It is a specific place with a specific shape. It is the northern coast of Antarctica. But Antarctica was not discovered until 1820. That is a fact. The first confirmed sighting of the Antarctic mainland was by a Russian expedition led by Fabian Gottlieb von Bellingshausen and Mikhail Laziev on January 27, 1820. They saw ice. Impenetrable, endless, world-ending ice. Piri Reis, drawing his map in Istanbul in 1513, could not have seen Antarctica. Even if some ancient sailor had somehow crossed the treacherous Southern Ocean, they would not have seen a mountainous coastline. They would have seen a wall of ice, extending for thousands of miles. The continent beneath that ice has not been visible to the naked eye for millions of years, since before the human species existed. And yet there it is, a coastline. This is the serpent in the garden of the map. This is the detail that transforms a historical curiosity into a profound, unsettling mystery. In the 1960s, an American historian named Charles Hapgood became obsessed with the Piri Reis map. He was not a geologist, not a cartographer by training, but he had a radical theory. He believed that the map, and others like it, were evidence of a lost global civilization, a civilization that had mapped the entire planet at the height of the last ice age, before the great sheets of ice retreated and the sea levels rose. Hapgood took the Piri Reis map to the United States Air Force. He asked them to evaluate it. He wanted to know if the coastline at the bottom of the map could possibly be accurate. The response, when it came, was staggering. The Air Force cartographers confirmed that the map was remarkably accurate. They noted that the depiction of the Andes Mountains in South America, for example, was surprisingly correct. But the southern coastline was the real shock. They concluded that the map appeared to show the coastline of Queen Maud Land, a part of Antarctica, but it showed it without ice. It showed the rivers flowing from the mountains, the bays cutting into the land, the very topography that is now buried under a mile of frozen water. The only way the Piri Reis map could be accurate, the Air Force report suggested, was if it was based on source maps that had been drawn before Antarctica was covered in ice. Before the Ice Age. The implications are too large to grasp all at once. They are like trying to hold an ocean in your hands. If the source maps were that old, then the history we have been taught, the story of civilization we have built our world upon, is not a complete story. It is a fragment, a single chapter torn from a much larger book. Piri Reis did not know what he had drawn. He was a compiler, a scribe of ghostlines. He copied the ancient charts, including the one that showed this impossible southern land, and he placed it on his map. He may have thought it was the mythical terra australis, a necessary balance to the world. He could not have known that he was drawing a memory of a world that existed before our own. The question now is not how Piri Reis knew. The question is, who knew before him and what happened to them? The darkness deepens. Keep the candle lit. Let us leave the frozen south and return to the world of men, to the world of power, ambition, and empires. For the map was not created in a vacuum. It was created for a purpose, and that purpose was to be seen by a single pair of eyes. The eyes of a sultan. In 1517, 4 years after completing his great map, Piri Reis traveled to Cairo. The city had just fallen to the Ottoman armies of Sultan Selim I, a conqueror so fierce he was known as Yavuz, the Grim. The Mamluk Sultanate, which had ruled Egypt and Syria for centuries, had been crushed. The Ottoman Empire was now the undisputed master of the Eastern Mediterranean and the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. Piri Reis, the admiral scholar, came not as a conqueror but as a supplicant. He came bearing gifts, and his greatest gift was the map. Imagine the scene: the audience chamber of the Mamluk Palace in Cairo, now the temporary court of the Ottoman Sultan. The walls are draped in tapestries, the air is thick with incense. Selim I sits on a raised dais, his face impassive, his eyes dark and penetrating. He is a small man, but his presence fills the room. He has drowned princes, strangled his own brothers, and expanded his empire to its greatest extent. He is not easily impressed. Into this room walks Piri Reis. He is older now, his face weathered by decades at sea. He carries a rolled parchment under his arm. He kneels before the Sultan. He speaks. He speaks of the ocean to the west. He speaks of the lands discovered by the Genoese infidels. He speaks of the Portuguese, who are even now sailing around Africa, threatening Muslim trade routes in the Indian Ocean. He unrolls his map before the Sultan. He is not just showing off a work of art. He is making an argument. He is saying, "Look, my Sultan, look at the world. The infidels are exploring it, mapping it, claiming it. But we, the Ottomans, are not blind. We see what they see. We know what they know. This map is proof of our intelligence, our reach, our power. We can compete with them. We can defeat them." For Selim I, the map was not a mystery. It was not a philosophical puzzle. It was a piece of military intelligence. It was a tool of statecraft. Historical records confirm this meeting. We know that Piri Reis presented his map, along with a series of other charts and a gift of gold and slaves, to Sultan Selim I in Cairo in 1517. We know that the Sultan received him well. We know that Piri Reis returned to his naval duties, his loyalty proven, his genius acknowledged by the highest power in the Islamic world. And then the map vanishes. Selim I took it back to the imperial capital, Constantinople. He placed it in his treasury or his library among the other treasures of the empire. And there it lay for over 400 years, while the world outside the palace walls changed beyond recognition. For the Ottomans, the map was a moment, a curiosity, a piece of the vast machinery of empire. They did not study it for its secrets. They did not ponder its impossible coastlines. They saw it, appreciated it, and then, like so many things in a great empire, they forgot it. It slept, rolled in its dark corner, waiting for a light that would not come for centuries. The empire's eye had looked upon the map, but it had not truly seen. Keep the candle lit. 400 years. Consider that span of time. It is longer than the United States has existed. It is longer than the time between the building of the great Gothic cathedrals and the present day. It is a period vast enough to contain the rise and fall of entire civilizations. For 400 years, the map of Piri Reis slept. Where did it sleep? In the imperial archives of the Topkapi Palace, a labyrinth of stone corridors, vaulted chambers, and hidden cupboards built to contain the accumulated detritus of 6 centuries of Ottoman rule. Imagine it, a place where jewel-encrusted swords lay next to dusty tax records, where the robes of sultans hung in silent rows, their former occupants nothing but dust, where the air itself was thick with the smell of old paper, leather, and the faint, sweet perfume of decay. The map was there, rolled tight and placed on a shelf. Perhaps it was labeled once. Perhaps the label faded. Perhaps it was simply forgotten, pushed to the back as new treasures arrived: Chinese porcelain, Venetian glass, Persian miniatures. In these long centuries of sleep, the world outside the palace walls transformed. The Ottoman Empire itself, so powerful in 1517, slowly aged, weakened, and finally crumbled. The great ships that Piri Reis had commanded, the galleys powered by oars and sails, were replaced by ironclads and steamships. The compass and astrolabe were replaced by the sextant and the chronometer. The knowledge on the map became common knowledge. European explorers mapped the coastlines of the Americas with painstaking accuracy. They sailed around the tip of South America through the straits that bore Magellan's name. They crossed the Pacific and mapped its countless islands. They finally, in 1820, sighted the icy coast of Antarctica. Everything that was mysterious about the map in 1513 was, by the 19th century, simply known. The map had become obsolete. It was no longer a tool of empire or a window onto the unknown. It was just an old piece of parchment, a relic of a bygone age. And so it slept on. Generations of palace officials passed by the shelves where it lay. Librarians catalogued other books, other scrolls. Curators polished other treasures. The map waited, its secrets intact, its questions unasked. The 19th century gave way to the 20th. The Ottoman Empire, the sick man of Europe, finally expired after the First World War. In 1923, the Republic of Turkey was born. The Topkapi Palace, once the heart of a mighty empire, was transformed into a museum. The shelves and cupboards were no longer the private domain of sultans. They were now the responsibility of scholars and curators. One of those scholars was a man named Gustav Diesmann, a German theologian, a professor from the University of Berlin. He did not come to Istanbul looking for maps. He came looking for biblical manuscripts, for ancient religious texts, for the echoes of saints and prophets. He had no idea what he was about to find. The map had been asleep for 400 years, but all things that sleep must, eventually, wake. The key was turning in the lock. Keep the candle lit. Istanbul, 1929. The city is no longer Constantinople, the capital of an empire. It is a republican city, modernizing, looking forward. But in the old palace, on the Seraglio Point, where the Golden Horn meets the Bosphorus, the past still clings to every stone. Gustav Diesmann is not a young man. He is in his 60s, a lifetime of scholarship etched into his features. He has been given permission to search the palace's archives for ancient religious texts. He moves through the corridors with the focused attention of a man who has spent his life looking for needles in historical haystacks. He is accompanied by the director of the museum, a man named Halil Edhem. Together, they have been examining shelves, opening chests, unrolling scrolls. The work is slow, dusty, and often tedious. And then Halil Edhem reaches for something on a high shelf, a roll of painted leather, forgotten, pushed aside. It is not in a chest, it is not wrapped in silk, it is just there, gathering dust. He hands it to Diesmann. The theologian takes the roll. It is light, delicate. The leather is dry, the color of aged honey. He carries it to a table near the window, where the amber light of the late afternoon sun can fall upon it. He unrolls it carefully, slowly. The edges are brittle. The painted surface is cracked in places, but as the parchment unfurls, the colors begin to emerge from the darkness of centuries. The blue of the ocean, the green of the mountains, the red of the tiny ships, the black lines of the coastlines, drawn with a precision that seems impossible for its age. Diesmann is a theologian. He knows Greek and Latin and Hebrew. He knows the history of the Bible, the travels of St. Paul, the intricacies of early Christian doctrine. He does not know at first what he is looking at. But he sees the writing, the elegant Ottoman script covering the map like a lacework of ink. He cannot read it fluently, but he recognizes it, and he sees the date. 919, Muharram, 1513. His breath catches. He has found something. He does not know what, but he knows it is old and beautiful and important. He calls Halil Edhem over. The Turkish director leans close, studying the script. He begins to read aloud, translating the marginal notes for the German scholar. A map of the Western lands, drawn by Piri Reis, compiled from approximately 20 charts, including a chart drawn by Colombo, the Genoese, showing the coasts and islands of these lands. Diesmann listens, His eyes move from the text to the map itself. He traces the coast of Africa. He sees the familiar bulge, the familiar sweep. Then his gaze moves west, across the Atlantic, to the large landmass on the left. His finger follows the coastline. It is too detailed, too confident, too accurate. And then he looks down, to the bottom of the map, to the very edge of the world. There is no empty space. There is a coastline. He does not know it yet, but in this moment, in the amber light of a Turkish afternoon, the question that will haunt the 20th century has just been born. The ghost has awakened. Keep the candle lit. The map is not silent, it speaks. In the years following its rediscovery, scholars descended upon the Topkapi map. They photographed it, measured it, and most importantly, they translated its words. And what they found in those marginal notes was as astonishing as the map itself. Piri Reis, the old admiral, had left a confession, not a confession of sin, but a confession of method. He told us, in his own words, exactly how he had created his masterpiece. We can almost hear his voice, filtered through the centuries, speaking to us from the lamplight. It is related by the infidels. He writes in one note, referring to Columbus, that a book came from the west to the court of the Genoese, in which it was stated that the coast and islands of the Antilles were discovered by the said Columbo. He is telling us that Columbus himself had access to older sources, that the great explorer was not sailing into the unknown, but following a map that already existed. The book that came from the west, what was it? Who had drawn it? The question hangs in the air, unanswered. Elsewhere on the map, he makes his most important confession. He describes his sources. I have consulted, he writes, some 20 charts and mappi mundi. Among these are 8 such mappi mundi drawn in the time of Alexander the Great, showing the inhabited quarter of the world. The Arabs call these charts Jafarieh. I have also consulted the map of the western lands drawn by Columbo. Let us pause here. Let us absorb the magnitude of this single sentence. Piri Reis claims to have used maps drawn in the time of Alexander the Great. That is the 4th century BCE, over 1,800 years before he sat down to draw his own map. He is telling us that ancient Greek cartographers, working in the wake of Alexander's conquests, had mapped the inhabited quarter of the world with a sophistication that has been lost to history. And these maps, these Jafarieh charts, somehow survived. They were copied and passed down through the centuries, through the libraries of Byzantium and the academies of the Islamic world. They found their way into the hands of Columbus, and then, through a captured Spanish sailor, into the hands of Piri Reis. The map is not a work of exploration. It is a work of memory. It is a testament to the survival of knowledge across the abyss of time. Piri Reis did not understand all that he was preserving. When he copied the ancient chart that showed the southern coastline, the land that would one day be called Antarctica, he did not know it was a land buried under ice. He simply copied what he saw. He was a faithful scribe, a conduit for ghostlines. His confession is also a warning. It tells us that history is not a straight line of progress. It is a cycle of loss and recovery, of forgetting and remembering. The knowledge that we think we have discovered anew may be nothing more than a rediscovery of something very, very old. The cartographer's voice falls silent. The scratching pen is still. We are left alone with his words and the impossible weight of what they imply. The revelation is not that the map is accurate. The revelation is that the map is a library of lost worlds. Keep the candle lit. The 20th century was not content to simply marvel at the Piri Reis map. It demanded answers, and the questions it asked were heretical. The man who asked the loudest, the most persistent, the most unsettling questions was an American college professor named Charles Hapgood. He taught history at Keene State College in New Hampshire, but his mind ranged far beyond the confines of any syllabus. Hapgood was not a cartographer, he was not a geologist. He was an amateur in the truest sense of the word, a lover of ideas, and he had an idea that consumed him. He believed that the Piri Reis map, along with other ancient maps he had studied, was evidence of a global Ice Age civilization. A civilization that had mapped the entire planet thousands of years before any known culture. A civilization that had been destroyed, its knowledge scattered, its ghostlines waiting to be read. In the late 1950s, Hapgood wrote to the United States Air Force. He sent them his analysis of the Piri Reis map and asked for their expert opinion. He wanted to know scientifically whether the map was as accurate as he believed it to be. The response, when it came, was classified, but eventually it was declassified, and its contents sent a shockwave through the small world of alternative history. The Air Force cartographers, men trained in the most advanced techniques of map-making and aerial photography, confirmed Hapgood's core thesis. They stated that the Piri Reis map was remarkably accurate in its depiction of the South American coastline, particularly the Andes Mountains. But the southern coastline was the real revelation. They concluded that the map appeared to show the Princess Martha coast of Queen Maud Land in Antarctica, as well as a peninsula that might be the Palmer Peninsula. The problem, as they noted, was that the coastline was depicted in detail, with mountains and rivers, while the actual coastline of Queen Maud Land has been buried under a mile-thick sheet of ice for at least 6,000 years, and probably much longer. The only way to explain the map's accuracy, the Air Force report stated, was if the source maps had been drawn before the ice covered the land. This was the moment the question became dangerous. If the source maps were drawn before the Ice Age, then who drew them? The known civilizations of the time, ancient Egypt, Sumer, the Indus Valley, were just beginning to form. They were building their first cities, inventing their first writing. They did not have the technology to survey a continent. Unless there was another civilization, one that left no cities, no writing, no monuments that we have recognized, one that existed so long ago that its entire world was erased by ice and rising seas. This is the heresy of the question. It asks us to imagine a past that does not fit the tidy narrative of human progress. It suggests that we are not the first great civilization on this planet. It implies that everything we have built, everything we know, may be built upon the ruins of a world we have completely forgotten. Mainstream historians and archaeologists rejected Hapgood's theory. They pointed to the lack of physical evidence, the speculative nature of his claims, the impossibility of proving such a vast and ancient hypothesis. They argued with good reason that the map's accuracy could be explained by other means, by coincidence, by the natural shape of coastlines, by the misinterpretation of the marginal notes. But for those who looked at the map and saw the ghostlines, the question would not go away. It lingered, like a half-remembered dream, a whisper from a time before memory. The map had been examined, it had been analyzed, but its deepest secret remained intact. It remained a question, not an answer. And sometimes, the questions are more powerful than any answer could be. Keep the candle lit. Where does a mystery end? Does it end with a solution, a neat answer that ties up every loose thread and sends us home satisfied? Or does it end with a question, a lingering echo that follows us out the door and into the night? The map of Piri Reis rests today in the Topkapi Palace Library. It is kept in a climate-controlled environment, protected from light, from humidity, from the destructive touch of time. It is visited by scholars, studied by historians, admired by those few who are granted permission to see it. It is a treasure, a relic, a masterpiece of cartographic art. But it is also a question mark, a piece of dried skin that refuses to be silent. We have traced its story from the deck of a corsair's ship to the audience chamber of an Ottoman sultan. We have followed its journey through 400 years of darkness and into the amber light of a 20th century afternoon. We have listened to the cartographer's confession and weighed the heresy of the questions it inspires. And what have we learned? We have learned that history is not a straight line. It is a palimpsest, a parchment that has been written on, scraped clean, and written on again. The ghostlines of older stories show through the text of our own. We have learned that knowledge is fragile. It can be burned in a library, drowned in a rising sea, buried under a mile of ice. It can be forgotten for centuries, waiting in the dark for a hand to unroll it and a mind to wonder. And we have learned that the greatest mysteries are not the ones we solve, but the ones that solve us. They reveal our assumptions, our biases, our desperate need for a world that makes sense. The Piri Reis map does not make sense. It defies the neat categories we have built. It refuses to fit the story we have told ourselves about who we are and where we came from. Perhaps the map is a forgery, perhaps it is a lucky guess. Perhaps the coastline at the bottom is not Antarctica at all, but the tip of South America distorted by the map's projection. Perhaps the ancient sources Piri Reis cited were not as old as he believed. Perhaps. But perhaps not. The power of the map is not in the certainty of its answers. It is in the persistence of its questions. It sits in its quiet archive, a challenge to our complacency. It whispers to anyone who will listen, "You do not know everything. Your history is incomplete. There is more to the story." And that whisper, that faint echo from the past, is more valuable than any treasure. It keeps us curious. It keeps us searching. It keeps the candle lit. We step away from the fire now. We leave the candle burning low on the table. The story is told, but the mystery remains. And perhaps that is as it should be. For in the end, we are all navigators on an unknown sea, guided by ghostlines we can barely perceive, sailing towards a horizon we will never reach. The map that changed the world did so not by showing us new lands, but by showing us how much of the world and of ourselves we have yet to discover. The ghostlines remain, and so do we.